Zethkar sat in the briefing room and tried not to show his excitement. The walls around him glowed with soft blue light that made everything feel calm and peaceful. Other officers from different worlds filled the seats beside him, but nobody talked much. They all knew this meeting was important. Commander Velenov walked into the room with slow steps that made clicking sounds on the metal floor. His forearms moved in patterns that meant he was thinking hard about something. All the officers straightened up in their chairs when they saw him. "We have found a new species," the commander said in his deep voice. "They call themselves humans, and they live on a world they name Earth. These creatures are still very young in terms of space travel. They cannot even leave their own star system yet." Zethkar felt his heart beat faster. Finding new species was always exciting for someone who studied different kinds of life across the galaxy. He had spent most of his career watching peaceful races that grew food and built simple machines. This might be his chance to see something different. The commander pressed a button and pictures appeared in the air above them. The images showed a blue and green world with white clouds moving across its surface. Earth sits in what they call the Sol system. The planet has large amounts of water and supports many different types of life forms. The dominant species appears to be these humans. More pictures showed the creatures themselves. They walked on 2 legs and had only 2 arms each. Their skin came in different colors and they covered their bodies with various materials. Some had hair on their heads while others did not. They looked quite weak compared to most species Zethkar had studied before. "These humans are currently engaged in what they call warfare," Commander Velenov continued. "They fight among themselves using primitive weapons that shoot metal pieces and create explosions. Our scientists believe this presents an excellent opportunity to study pre-spaceflight violence before we decide whether to make contact with them." The commander's eyes looked directly at Zethkar. "Officer Zethkar, you have been chosen for this mission. Your experience studying violent cultures makes you the best choice for this assignment. You will observe their conflicts and report back to us with detailed information about their military capabilities and social structures." Zethkar stood up and saluted in the traditional way. "I accept this mission with honor, Commander. How long should I expect to remain in their system?" "Take as much time as you need," the commander replied. "These humans appear to be fighting a large war that involves most of their world. They call it World War III. Our early scans suggest it started over resources and territory, which is typical for primitive species. The conflict should provide plenty of data for your research." Other officers began asking questions about the mission details. They wanted to know about the ship Zethkar would use and what equipment he would need. The commander explained that a small stealth vessel would be prepared with the latest scanning technology. Zethkar would be able to observe the humans without them knowing he was there. "Remember," Commander Velenov said as the meeting ended, "these creatures are pre-spaceflight. They have never met other intelligent species and they do not know we exist. Your job is to watch and learn, not to interfere. We need to understand what kind of species they are before we decide how to handle them." Zethkar walked back to his quarters feeling proud and nervous at the same time. This was his biggest assignment yet. Most of the species he had studied before used simple weapons, like spears and arrows. These humans had more advanced technology, but they were still limited to their own world. How dangerous could they really be? He spent the next few days preparing for the journey. The ship's computer was loaded with information about human languages so he could understand their communications. Special sensors would let him watch their movements from space without being detected. Everything seemed routine and normal. The day before he left, Zethkar received his final briefing. The commander showed him the latest images from Earth. Large groups of humans were moving across the continents in organized formations. Explosions lit up the dark side of the planet where it was nighttime. Smoke rose from many cities, and the humans appeared to be fighting on land, in the air, and on their oceans. "It looks like standard primitive warfare," the commander said. "They probably use simple tactics and brute force. Your job is to document their methods so we can understand how violent they truly are. Most species this young fight in very predictable ways. Zethkar nodded and gathered his belongings. As his ship lifted off from the station and headed toward Earth, he felt confident about the mission ahead. He expected to find a typical pre-spaceflight species that threw rocks and shot metal bullets at each other. The assignment would probably be boring, but it would help advance his career. The journey to Earth took several days, but Zethkar used the time to study what little information they had about humans. The pictures and data suggested they were not very different from other young species he had observed. They seemed to fight over the same things that all primitive races fought about: land, water, food, and power. As his ship approached Earth's solar system, Zethkar felt ready to begin his work. He had no idea that everything he thought he knew about warfare was about to change forever. Zethkar positioned his ship in a hidden spot behind Earth's moon where the humans could not see him. His scanning equipment came online and immediately began collecting information about the planet below. The amount of activity surprised him right away. Everywhere he looked, humans were moving in organized groups across the surface. The first few days of observation seemed normal enough. Zethkar watched human armies march across continents and gather near cities. They used vehicles that moved on wheels and tracked the ground with metal treads. Their aircraft flew through the sky, dropping explosive devices on enemy positions. Everything looked like standard primitive warfare that he had seen from other young species. Zethkar began writing his initial reports to send back to the Confederation. He described the humans as disappointingly typical in their approach to fighting. They seemed to use basic tactics and relied on simple weapons that shot metal projectiles or created chemical explosions. Their technology was crude but not unusual for a species that had not yet learned to travel between stars. Then he decided to focus on individual battles instead of watching the whole war from a distance. That decision changed everything he thought. He knew about these creatures. The Battle of New Geneva started on a Tuesday morning when Zethkar noticed unusual movement near a large city in what the humans called Europe. A small group of Western Alliance soldiers was approaching a heavily defended Eastern Coalition position. Zethkar counted 12 soldiers in the attacking force while his sensors detected over 200 enemy troops in the fortified area. Any reasonable species would have retreated immediately or called for massive reinforcements. Zethkar had seen this situation dozens of times before when studying other worlds. The smaller force always either ran away or died trying to attack an impossible target. He prepared to document another example of primitive military thinking. Instead, the human force stopped several kilometers away from their target and did something that made no sense. They spread out and began watching the enemy position for hours without moving closer. Zethkar checked his equipment several times to make sure it was working correctly. Why were they just sitting there? The leader of the human force was a female. They called Captain Lisa Hayes. Zethkar focused his sensors on her and listened to the communications between her soldiers. What he heard made him question everything he thought he understood about warfare. Hayes was not planning a simple attack. She was studying the enemy position like a scientist studies a complex problem. Her soldiers were gathering information about guard rotations, supply deliveries, communication patterns, and weak points in the defensive structure. They mapped out every detail of the enemy's daily routine and looked for patterns that could be exploited. After 6 hours of observation, Hayes called her team together for what humans called a briefing. Zethkar listened carefully as she explained her plan. The attack would not be a direct assault on the fortified position. Instead, they would strike at 3 different targets simultaneously to create confusion and panic among the enemy forces. The first part of the plan involved what Hayes called psychological warfare. Her soldiers would use sound equipment to make noise that sounded like a much larger attacking force. The enemy would think they were being attacked by hundreds of troops instead of just 12. The second part was even more surprising. Hayes had discovered that the enemy forces received their orders through a computer network. Her team included specialists who could break into these systems and send false information. They planned to make the enemy commanders think they were being attacked from directions where no attack was actually happening. The third part of the plan was the most shocking to Zethkar. Hayes intended to cut off the enemy's supply lines by destroying key roads and bridges. This would force the enemy to choose between abandoning their position or running out of food and ammunition. No species Zethkar had ever studied thought about warfare in such complex ways. Most primitive races simply charged at their enemies and hoped for the best. These humans were treating the battle like a puzzle that needed to be solved rather than a contest of strength. The attack began at dawn and unfolded exactly as Hayes had planned. Her soldiers used their sound equipment to create the illusion of massive armies approaching from multiple directions. The noise echoed off the surrounding hills and made it impossible for the enemy to determine where the real threat was coming from. At the same time, the human computer specialists broke into the enemy communication network and began sending false orders. Enemy units received commands to abandon their positions and move to defend areas that were not actually under attack. Confusion spread through their ranks as different groups received contradictory instructions, while the enemy was distracted. By these deceptions, other members of Hayes' team destroyed the bridges and roads that supplied the fortified position. Explosions cut off the main supply routes and left the enemy forces isolated without support. Within 14 hours, the entire Eastern Coalition position had collapsed. Over 200 well-equipped soldiers surrendered to Hayes and her 12 troops without putting up significant resistance. The enemy had been defeated not by superior firepower but by superior thinking. Zethkar watched the recordings of the battle over and over again. His equipment had recorded everything correctly, but he could not believe what he was seeing. No pre-spaceflight species should be capable of such sophisticated tactical planning. The humans had used their primitive technology with a level of intelligence that rivaled advanced galactic civilizations. He immediately sent a priority report to the Confederation describing what he had witnessed. The response came back quickly, but it was not what he expected. His superiors told him that he must be making mistakes in his observations. They reminded him that humans were a primitive species that had not even developed faster-than-light travel yet. Advanced tactical thinking was impossible for such creatures. The message from Commander Velenoth was clear and direct. Continue your observations and provide more objective analysis. Remember that these humans are pre-spaceflight barbarians. Do not let their crude technology fool you into thinking they are more advanced than they actually are. Zethkar stared at his instruments and wondered if he was losing his mind. The evidence was right there in front of him, but his own people refused to believe it. These humans were not fighting like any primitive species he had ever studied. They were using their brains to overcome limitations in their technology and achieving results that should have been impossible. As he prepared to continue his observations, Zethkar felt a chill run through his body. If the humans could do this much damage with their current weapons, what would they be capable of if they ever developed advanced technology? For the first time since arriving at Earth, he began to wonder if watching these creatures was really such a good idea. 3 months had passed since Zethkar first arrived at Earth, and he was beginning to understand that his initial reports had been completely wrong. These humans were not primitive barbarians fighting with simple weapons. They were something far more dangerous than anyone in the Confederation had imagined. The realization hit him fully during what the humans called the Siege of Moscow. The Western Alliance forces had surrounded the massive city but faced an impossible situation. The Eastern Coalition had turned Moscow into a fortress with advanced defensive systems and nearly 3 million civilian humans trapped inside. Any direct attack would result in enormous casualties on both sides. Zethkar had seen similar sieges on other worlds, and they always followed the same pattern. The attacking force would either accept massive losses in a direct assault or abandon the attack entirely. Sometimes siege warfare dragged on for years until one side ran out of supplies. The outcome was always determined by which side had more resources or better weapons. General Pete Collins commanded the Western Alliance forces surrounding Moscow, and Zethkar expected him to follow standard military doctrine. Collins had approximately 400,000 soldiers under his command, while the enemy had roughly the same number plus the advantage of defensive positions. Normal logic suggested that Collins would need at least twice as many troops to have any chance of success. Instead of calling for reinforcements or planning a traditional assault, Collins did something that made Zethkar question his own sanity. The general assembled a team of specialists that included people who were not even soldiers. Dr. Amy Rodriguez was a scientist who studied how brains worked, while Colonel Steve Barnes was an expert in what humans called unconventional warfare. Zethkar watched in fascination as these three humans spent days analyzing the situation from angles that no other species would have considered. They were not planning to break through the enemy defenses or overwhelm them with superior firepower. They were looking for ways to make the enemy defeat themselves. The solution they developed was so complex that Zethkar had to replay his recordings multiple times to understand what was happening. Collins and his team launched a coordinated information campaign designed to convince the coalition soldiers that their own commanders had abandoned them. At the same time, they used sound equipment to create the illusion of massive armies approaching. From all directions, Dr. Rodriguez contributed knowledge about human psychology that helped predict how the enemy soldiers would react to different types of pressure. She understood that humans who felt isolated and betrayed by their leaders would be more likely to surrender than humans who believed they were fighting for a noble cause. Colonel Barnes added, expertise in deception and misdirection that turned the enemy's own communication systems against them. His specialists learned how to intercept coalition radio transmissions and replace them with false information that supported the alliance narrative. The psychological pressure campaign began with subtle changes to the information reaching coalition soldiers. Reports about the war from other fronts were altered to suggest that the Eastern Coalition was losing badly everywhere. Supply deliveries became irregular and were accompanied by rumors that the coalition leadership was preparing to evacuate and leave the Moscow defenders to their fate. Within the first week, Zethkar could detect changes in the behavior of coalition forces inside the city. Soldiers were abandoning their posts more frequently and discipline was breaking down in many units. The false reports were having exactly the effect that Collins and his team had predicted. The breakthrough came when Dr. Rodriguez developed a method to hijack the coalition's own propaganda broadcasts. Instead of blocking enemy communications, the alliance specialists learned how to replace the content with their own messages while making it appear that the transmissions were still coming from coalition headquarters. Coalition soldiers began receiving orders that seemed to come from their own commanders but actually originated from alliance sources. These false orders were carefully designed to create confusion and paranoia among enemy forces. Different units received contradictory instructions that made them suspicious of each other and uncertain about their real objectives. The most brilliant part of the deception involved creating evidence of a fictional third faction that was, supposedly, attacking both sides. Alliance specialists manufactured communications that suggested a rebel group within the coalition was planning to overthrow the government and negotiate a separate peace with the West within 72 hours of implementing this strategy. Coalition units inside Moscow began surrendering without firing a shot. Soldiers who had been prepared to fight to the death were convinced that their own side had betrayed them and that continued resistance was pointless. The city fell with minimal damage to civilian areas and almost no casualties among the defending forces. Zethkar watched in horror as nearly 300,000 coalition soldiers laid down their weapons and surrendered to an enemy that had never actually attacked them. This was not warfare as it existed anywhere else in the galaxy. Every other species Zethkar had studied used warfare as a simple contest of strength, where the side with better weapons or more soldiers usually won. These humans had turned warfare into a complex problem-solving exercise where victory went to whoever could think more creatively. The implications terrified him beyond anything he had experienced in his career. If humans could achieve this level of success with their current primitive technology, what would they be capable of with advanced weapons and communication systems? They were already demonstrating abilities that most galactic civilizations did. Not possess? Zethkar sent another urgent report to the Confederation, but once again his superiors dismissed his findings. They insisted that he was overestimating human capabilities and reminded him that these creatures had not even learned to leave their own planet yet. The response suggested that he might need psychological evaluation if he continued to submit such unrealistic assessments. The rejection of his reports frustrated Zethkar but also made him more determined to document everything he was witnessing. If the Confederation leadership would not listen to his warnings, he would at least create a complete record of human capabilities for future reference. As he prepared to continue his observations, Zethkar realized that he was probably the only being in the galaxy who truly understood what these humans represented. They were not just another primitive species that would eventually develop space travel and join the galactic community. They were something entirely different and potentially far more dangerous than anyone suspected. The thought that kept him awake during his rest periods was simple but terrifying. If humans could accomplish this much while limited to a single planet, what would happen when they finally developed the technology to travel between stars? Zethkar was beginning to fear that he might be watching the early development of a species that would one day challenge the established order of the entire galaxy. Zethkar had been observing Earth for 8 months when he witnessed something that made him question everything he understood about technological development. The Battle of the Pacific Rim began when the Eastern Coalition unveiled what they considered their most advanced weapons, autonomous underwater machines armed with explosive devices that could operate without human control. By galactic standards, these underwater drones represented impressive technology for a pre-spaceflight species. Zethkar had seen similar weapons used by civilizations that were much more advanced than humans. The Coalition drones could navigate underwater, identify targets, and attack enemy vessels with minimal human supervision. It seemed like the Eastern Coalition had gained a decisive advantage in naval warfare. The Western Alliance response should have been predictable. Most species would have tried to build bigger weapons, stronger armor, or more powerful defensive systems. Instead, the humans did something that defied every principle of technological advancement that Zethkar had learned during his career. Admiral Kate Sullivan commanded the Alliance naval forces in the Pacific Ocean, and she faced an impossible challenge. The Coalition had deployed over 3,000 underwater drones across a vast area of ocean. Traditional naval tactics would require the Alliance to either avoid the entire region or accept massive losses while fighting through the drone swarms. Instead of following conventional military thinking, Sullivan assembled a team that included Commander Ben Taylor, an engineer who specialized in what humans called artificial intelligence, and Dr. Helen Foster, a civilian programmer who had been working on computer systems before the war began. Zethkar focused his sensors on their planning sessions and listened to conversations that gradually revealed the scope of human innovation. These 3 individuals were not trying to build weapons that could overpower the Coalition drones. They were creating weapons that could think and adapt like living creatures. Taylor explained to Sullivan that human-computer technology had reached a point where machines could be taught to learn from experience rather than simply following programmed instructions. The Alliance could build defensive systems that would become more effective each time they encountered enemy attacks. Dr. Foster contributed expertise in programming techniques that would allow Alliance machines to analyze enemy behavior patterns and predict future attacks. More importantly, she understood how to create computer programs that could modify themselves based on new information they gathered during combat. The solution they developed made Zethkar wonder if humans were actually as primitive as the Confederation believed. The Alliance began deploying defensive systems that were not just programmed to respond to specific threats. These systems were designed to observe enemy tactics, learn from each encounter, and develop new strategies for dealing with future attacks. Within days of the first encounters between Coalition drones and Alliance defenses, Zethkar noticed changes in the behavior of Alliance systems that should have been impossible. The defensive networks were adapting to Coalition attack patterns and developing countermeasures that had not been programmed by their creators. the Alliance systems began predicting, where coalition drones would attack before the drones themselves had selected their targets. They learned to recognize the electronic signatures of different drone types and developed specific responses for each variant. Most shocking of all, they started coordinating their actions across vast distances without any central command structure. But the true horror of human innovation emerged when Dr. Foster deployed what she called viral warfare programs. These were not biological viruses, but information-based attacks that could infect enemy computer systems and turn coalition technology against itself. Zethkar watched in disbelief as coalition drones began attacking their own submarines and surface vessels. Enemy communication networks started broadcasting alliance propaganda instead of coalition orders. Navigation systems led coalition forces into carefully prepared ambush instead of guiding them to their intended targets. The viral program spread through coalition networks like diseases spreading through a population. Each infected system became a source of further infection that could compromise additional enemy equipment. Within weeks, the coalition had lost effective control over most of their advanced underwater weapons. What terrified Zethkar most was realizing that humans had not simply built better weapons. They had created weapons that could improve themselves and turn enemy advantages into weaknesses through pure creative thinking. This represented a level of technological sophistication that most galactic civilizations never achieved. The implications went far beyond this single battle. If humans could teach their machines to think and adapt, what would happen when they developed more advanced technology? Their current computers were primitive by galactic standards, but they were being used with an intelligence that rivaled the most sophisticated systems in the Confederation. Zethkar sent increasingly urgent reports to his superiors, but their responses showed no understanding of what he was describing. The Confederation leadership continued to dismiss human capabilities as exaggerated observations from an analyst who had spent too much time in isolation. Commander Velenovs's latest message was particularly frustrating. These humans are still using chemical explosives and metal projectiles for their weapons. They have not even developed basic energy weapons yet. Stop attributing advanced capabilities to a species that cannot travel faster than light. The rejection of his reports forced Zethkar to consider possibilities that frightened him more than anything he had experienced. What if the Confederation's understanding of technological development was completely wrong? What if advanced technology was not about having better materials or more powerful energy sources, but about using whatever tools were available with maximum intelligence and creativity? Human weapons were primitive by galactic standards, but humans were using them in ways that produced results equivalent to much more advanced technology. They compensated for limitations in their equipment through superior tactics, innovative programming, and creative problem-solving that turned weaknesses into advantages. The Battle of the Pacific Rim ended with complete Alliance victory despite the Coalition's initial technological superiority. The underwater drone threat that should have dominated naval warfare for years was neutralized in less than 2 months. Coalition forces found themselves fighting against their own weapons, while Alliance systems became more effective with each passing day. As Zethkar prepared to continue his observations, he realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. These humans represented a form of intelligence that could overcome almost any limitation through pure innovative thinking. They did not just adapt to challenges, they made challenges adapt to them. The most terrifying thought was that everything he had observed represented humans learning warfare rather than practicing it. Each battle taught them new methods, and each challenge forced them to develop new capabilities. They were unconsciously preparing themselves for conflicts that might extend far beyond their own planet. Zethkar began to understand that his mission was not just about studying a primitive species. He was documenting the early development of something that might one day challenge the established order of the entire galaxy. The question was no longer whether humans would eventually develop space travel. The question was what would happen to everyone else when they did. 15 months had passed since Zethkar arrived at Earth, and the human war was entering its final phase. Both sides were exhausted from months of fighting, and their resources were running low. Military analysts across the galaxy would have predicted that this was when the conflict would end through negotiation or mutual collapse. Every species Zethkar had studied before followed the same pattern when pushed to their limits. The humans, however, seemed to follow no pattern that existed anywhere else in the known universe. The Northern Campaign began when Major Chris Parker received orders to lead the final Western Alliance offensive against Eastern Coalition forces that had retreated to heavily fortified mountain positions. The enemy had chosen their defensive locations perfectly, natural barriers that made direct assault nearly impossible even with overwhelming numbers. Parker commanded roughly 60,000 soldiers, while intelligence estimates suggested the coalition had similar numbers entrenched in positions that gave them every possible advantage. The mountains provided natural cover, limited approach routes, and elevated firing positions that would allow a smaller force to hold off much larger attacking armies. Zethkar had observed similar situations on dozens of other worlds. The standard outcome was either a bloody stalemate that lasted for years or the attacking force abandoning the assault entirely. No reasonable military commander would attempt to storm well-prepared mountain defenses without at least a 3-to-1 numerical advantage. Instead of following logical military doctrine, Parker did something that made Zethkar question whether humans understood the concept of impossible. The Major assembled a team that included Dr. Janet Morgan, a scientist who studied rocks and soil, and Professor Alan Crawford, a civilian who understood the laws of physics better than most military engineers. Zethkar listened to their planning sessions with growing amazement. These humans were not trying to figure out how to attack the mountain fortifications. They were planning to change the mountains themselves to eliminate the enemy's defensive advantages. Dr. Morgan explained that the mountain range had been shaped by natural forces over millions of years and was still subject to those same forces. Carefully placed explosives could trigger avalanches, redirect rivers, and reshape the landscape in ways that would make the coalition positions untenable. Professor Crawford contributed mathematical calculations that showed exactly where to place charges to achieve maximum effect with minimum resources. His understanding of physics allowed the team to predict how rocks would fall, how water would flow, and how the terrain could be modified to serve their tactical objectives. The plan they developed was so audacious that Zethkar initially assumed he had misunderstood their communications. Parker and his team intended to trigger controlled geological events that would literally reshape the battlefield to favor Alliance forces. They were going to move mountains. The operation began with teams of specialists infiltrating the area around coalition positions during nighttime hours. These teams placed explosive charges at specific locations that Dr. Morgan had identified as geological weak points. The charges were precisely calculated to trigger natural landslides and avalanches rather than creating simple explosions. Professor Crawford had developed timing sequences that would cause multiple geological events to occur in coordinated patterns. Rivers would be redirected to flood coalition supply routes while avalanches blocked escape routes and artillery positions. The mountain range itself would become a weapon against the forces trying to hide within it. Zethkar watched in fascination as the first phase of the plan unfolded. Small explosions triggered massive landslides that buried coalition observation posts and blocked mountain passes. Redirected streams created mudslides that made vehicle movement impossible. Within hours, the enemy found themselves trapped in positions that were no longer defensible. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical effects. Coalition soldiers who had felt secure in their mountain fortresses suddenly found themselves fighting against the landscape itself. Rocks fell from cliffs that had been stable for centuries. Rivers appeared where none had existed before. The very ground beneath their feet became unreliable, but the most brilliant aspect of the operation was that it achieved strategic objectives without requiring direct combat. Coalition forces were not defeated by superior firepower or tactical brilliance. They were defeated by humans who understood that warfare was not limited to fighting other soldiers, but could involve reshaping the entire environment. Major Parker's forces advanced through terrain that had been completely transformed by their own actions. Roads appeared where Dr. Morgan had triggered landslides to fill valleys. Rivers provided natural barriers exactly where the Alliance needed them. The mountain range had been turned into a giant machine designed to deliver victory. Coalition resistance collapsed within days as enemy units found themselves cut off from supplies and unable to maintain defensive positions that no longer existed. Thousands of soldiers surrendered not because they were outfought but because they could no longer comprehend what they were fighting against. The Northern campaign ended with complete Alliance victory and minimal casualties on either side. Zethkar realized that he had witnessed humans demonstrate their most dangerous characteristic when faced with impossible challenges. They did not accept limitations but instead changed the rules of engagement entirely. This was not warfare, as it existed anywhere else in the galaxy. Other species fought within the constraints of their environment and technology. Humans treated those constraints as problems to be solved rather than limitations to be accepted. They had turned the laws of physics into weapons and made the planet itself fight on their side. The implications terrified Zethkar beyond anything he had experienced during his long career. If humans could accomplish this much with primitive tools and limited resources, what would they be capable of with advanced technology? They had already demonstrated the ability to think beyond every limitation that other species considered absolute. Zethkar began preparing his final reports while the human war drew to its conclusion. The Alliance had won decisively, but what frightened him most was listening to human leaders, already discussing what they had learned and how those lessons could be applied to future challenges. Even in victory, humans were analyzing their methods and looking for ways to improve them. During the victory celebrations that followed the end of the war, Zethkar heard conversations that made his blood run cold. Human scientists and military leaders were talking about space exploration and wondering what kinds of challenges they might face beyond their own planet. They were already thinking about how their wartime innovations could be adapted for peaceful purposes. The thought that haunted Zethkar during his final days at Earth was simple but terrifying. He had spent 18 months watching humans at war, and in that time they had evolved from using conventional weapons to developing tactics that challenged fundamental assumptions about what was possible. They had turned warfare into a form of applied science that produced results no other species could achieve. If humans could advance this far in such a short time while fighting among themselves, what would happen when they unified their efforts and turned their attention to the stars? Zethkar was beginning to fear that he had witnessed the early stages of something that would eventually change the entire galaxy in ways that no one could predict or control. Zethkar's ship left Earth's solar system 18 months after his arrival, and the journey back to Confederation space gave him time to organize his observations into a comprehensive report. The document he prepared during that long voyage would become the most classified file in galactic history, though he did not know that at the time. The report began with his initial assumptions about human warfare and detailed how every single prediction had proven wrong. Humans did not fight like any other species in the galactic database. They treated warfare as a complex problem-solving exercise rather than a simple contest of strength or technology. Page after page documented examples of human innovation that challenged basic assumptions about what pre-spaceflight species could accomplish. The Battle of New Geneva showed tactical sophistication that rivaled advanced civilizations. The Siege of Moscow demonstrated psychological warfare capabilities that could defeat enemies without direct combat. The Pacific Rim campaign revealed technological adaptation that turned enemy advantages into weaknesses. The Northern campaign provided the most disturbing evidence of all. Humans had literally reshaped their planet's surface to achieve military objectives. They used knowledge of physics and geology to turn mountains and rivers into weapons. They fought against the landscape itself and won, but the report's most important sections focused not on individual battles but on patterns of behavior. that Zethkar had observed throughout the conflict. Humans consistently refused to accept limitations that other species considered absolute. When faced with impossible challenges, they changed the parameters of the problem rather than admitting defeat. Their weapons were primitive by galactic standards, but humans compensated for technological limitations through superior intelligence and creativity. They built machines that could learn and adapt. They created computer programs that turned enemy technology against itself. They developed tactics that made traditional military thinking obsolete. Most significantly, humans demonstrated the ability to accelerate their own development through warfare. Each battle taught them new methods, and each challenge forced them to develop new capabilities. The species that emerged from World War III was measurably more advanced than the one that had entered it 18 months earlier. Zethkar's psychological evaluation revealed the source of his trauma. He had realized during his observations that humanity's current conflicts represented them learning warfare rather than simply practicing it. Every engagement was an educational experience that prepared them for greater challenges ahead. The report concluded with projections that made Zethkar's hands shake as he wrote them. If humans continued developing at their current rate, they would achieve faster-than-light travel within decades rather than centuries. More importantly, they would possess military capabilities that no existing galactic civilization could match. When Zethkar arrived at Confederation headquarters, his report triggered the largest emergency session in the organization's history. The High Council reviewed his evidence in complete secrecy while military analysts verified his recordings and data. The conclusions reached during those closed sessions would reshape galactic policy for generations to come. Commander Velanoth led the final briefing that would determine humanity's fate. His forearms moved in patterns that indicated extreme agitation as he addressed the assembled council members. Officer Zethkar's observations have been independently verified. Everything in his report appears to be accurate. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Humans possessed intellectual capabilities that exceeded those of most spacefaring civilizations despite their primitive technology. They had demonstrated the ability to innovate beyond any known limits and showed no signs of slowing their development. We face an unprecedented situation, Velanoth continued. This species represents a potential threat to the established order of galactic civilization. Their approach to problem-solving suggests they would not integrate peacefully into existing power structures. The debate that followed lasted for days as council members struggled to understand the implications of Zethkar's findings. Some argued for immediate contact to guide human development in peaceful directions. Others suggested covert interference to slow their technological advancement. A few extremists even proposed military action to eliminate the threat before it could spread beyond Earth. The final decision was unlike anything in Confederation history. The Council voted unanimously to implement what became known as the Terra Quarantine Protocol. No Confederation vessel would be permitted within 50 light-years of Earth. All references to humanity's location would be classified beyond top secret. Official records would describe the Sol system as containing no intelligent life. The reasoning behind the quarantine was simple but terrifying. Humans had demonstrated capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about technological development and military science. Contact with galactic civilization might accelerate their advancement to levels that existing governments could not control. Zethkar received commendation for his thorough documentation, but also faced immediate reassignment to the most remote observation post in the galaxy. The official explanation was that his expertise with violent cultures was needed elsewhere. The real reason was that he knew too much about humanity's true capabilities. His final personal log entry revealed the depth of his psychological trauma. I came to Earth expecting to study a primitive species engaged in typical pre-spaceflight warfare. Instead, I watched warfare itself evolve to accommodate an impossible species. They turned every limitation into an advantage and every challenge into an opportunity for growth. The entry continued with observations that haunted him during his remaining years of service. Humans do not fight wars the way other species fight wars. They use wars to teach themselves how to solve problems that should not have solutions. Every battle makes them more dangerous than they were before. But the passage that became legendary among the few officials who had access to classified files dealt with humanity's future potential. In 18 months, I watched humans advance from conventional warfare to tactics that challenged the laws of physics themselves. They treat impossible problems as intellectual puzzles and refuse to accept defeat even when facing overwhelming odds. Zethkar's final words to the High Council became the unofficial motto of the Terra Quarantine Protocol. We wanted to study a primitive species learning warfare. Instead, I watched warfare evolving to serve an impossible species. Whatever we do, we must never let them know we exist until we understand what they truly are. The quarantine remained in effect for decades while Confederation scientists studied Zethkar's recordings and tried to develop countermeasures for theoretical human expansion into space. Deep space monitoring stations tracked human, technological development from a safe distance while xenopsychologists attempted to understand how one species could think so differently from every other known form of intelligent life. Years later, when humans finally achieved faster-than-light travel and began exploring beyond their solar system, they found a galaxy that was strangely empty of intelligent life. Star systems that should have contained thriving civilizations appeared to be abandoned. Ancient ruins suggested that advanced species had once existed, but vanished without explanation. The humans never suspected that an entire galactic civilization was hiding from them, waiting and watching while trying to decide whether contact was possible or whether their only option was to flee to another galaxy entirely. Zethkar's report had convinced the Confederation that humanity represented something unprecedented in galactic history, a species too dangerous to contact and too powerful to control. The observer who had been sent to watch humans at war had succeeded beyond his worst nightmares. His documentation was so thorough and his conclusions so convincing that an entire galactic civilization chose exile over the risk of meeting the species he had studied. The humans remained alone in their region of space, never knowing that their reputation for impossible solutions had preceded them to the stars.